On January 21st, the Vietnamese New Year, Tet, ushered in the Year of the Horse. Unaware of the Chinese zodiac at the time, I didn't realize that I was born under the sign of the horse 35 years earlier, or that 1966, the Year of the Horse, would be my year. It was the year I would establish myself in the big leagues, just as I had always hoped, on the ground in battle with exceptional troops. The action began on February 7th, 15 years and 1 day after Sergeant Combat made his name on a frigid morning in Korea. The battalion was heavily committed at Tu Hoa. Hank Emerson's A2 was operating in a brigade-sized area of operations. Known as the Strike Force Commander, Emerson had been fighting all over the battlefield and had already committed his reserve when, on the morning of February 7th, elements of Emerson's SE Company, commanded by Captain Robert Murphy, were pinned down and in danger of being flanked and destroyed by an NVA force of unknown size. The 327th had been called up from Phan Rang a couple of days earlier for just such a contingency. New Brigade Commander Pearson wanted me to take a task force to relieve and reinforce Murphy. "You have the Tigers and Bravo Company," he said. "Now go get them." I assembled a light CP group, including the Assistant Battalion S3 Don Chapman, our artillery LNO Don Corman, myself, and all relevant RTOs. We hopped into a waiting chopper, made contact with Murphy, who was surprisingly cheerful despite the dire situation, and after assessing the battle area, we coordinated fire support and returned to Tu Hoa. There, I briefed Bravo's CO, Al Heiser, and Tiger Commander Jim Gardner on the plan. Murphy's company was trapped in the northwest corner of a bombed-out village called Myan 2. My plan was to have the Tigers approach the surrounded unit's flank, while Bravo Company would swing around to the south and set up a blocking position deep behind the enemy. After a tactical air and artillery preparation, the Tigers would hit the enemy and roll up their flank. I anticipated that the enemy would break contact and run, only to be caught in the trap I had set with Bravo Company. The Tigers led the way out, and I went with them. We landed at an LZ close to the battle area. The men spread out and moved with the expertise of seasoned professionals. I, on the other hand, felt elated, like an actor finally seeing his name in lights after years of hard work. Ever since my arrival in Vietnam 8 months earlier, I had longed for another combat command. To get one as a major, and with the Tigers, whom I had considered my boys since their creation, was the greatest break I could have asked for. We guided by the sound of Murphy's firefight. C Company's commander was also putting maximum tactical air and artillery on the enemy surrounding him, but it wasn't proving very effective. The enemy soldiers were too close to Murphy's men for a successful bombardment without causing a lot of friendly casualties. We moved forward, killing as we went, dealing with around 10 enemy stragglers who had been foolish enough to engage the Tigers. These men were seasoned NVA troops, members of the elite 95th NVA Regiment, known for their formidable fighting skills during the Indochina War. They were probably the most formidable enemy fighters in South Vietnam. "Do I get the CIB now, Don Chapman?" I asked half-jokingly each time an enemy shot rang out. "Not yet," Chapman would reply with a quiet chuckle, remembering what that combat infantry badge meant to me during my longed-for baptism of fire. We reached a small knob by a river, across which we could see Murphy's men lying on the ground around the remains of blown-away houses. Unsatisfied with Murphy's radio update, I took advantage of a bamboo bridge that crossed the river to get a first-hand look at the situation. Unfortunately, a wide-open field lay between the bridge and Murphy's position. As Darrell Nunnally, my longtime RTO, and I dashed across the bridge, we became targets for professional marksmen armed with automatic weapons. After assessing the situation, Darrell and I made a hasty retreat across the field and bridge, narrowly escaping enemy fire. With the updated information, I ordered the Tigers to strike the enemy's flank and roll it up to unpin Murphy and send the NVA into Bravo's ambush. It was a textbook hammer and anvil maneuver straight out of Fort Benning. I gathered Corman, Chapman, Nunnally, and the rest of the CP group, and with the Tigers providing effective covering fire, we crossed the bridge. Corman, the best artilleryman I had seen since Alan Bell in Korea, neutralized the open field on the far side with smoke and artillery fire. Though the run was a bit risky, the shortcut saved us valuable time. "Do I get the CIB now?" Chapman asked as the CP group arrived intact at Murphy's position. "Not yet," I replied, and directed my team to dig in fast and deep. Automatic weapons were stitching across the area as we set up in the rubble of a bombed-out building. While Corman put together his artillery fire plan and Darrell and the other RTOs started digging a foxhole large enough for the entire CP group, a trick I'd learned from Colonel Johns's clay pigeons of St. Lowe, I took Chapman for a quick reconnaissance around the battle area. We crawled through the rubble of a couple of buildings and then through a ditch along a paddy dyke. Suddenly, an NVA soldier popped up from a hole he had burrowed into the side of the dyke. He was above us, and as we started shooting, we hit him first, while his rounds went high over our heads. "Do I get the CIB now, Chapman?" I asked dryly. "You got it, man," Chapman laughed. When we returned to our command post, I saw Darrell setting up his 292-29 ER2 antenna. It was heavy and unwieldy, but worth every pound for the best possible communication. Then I noticed Corman talking on the radio and the Tigers on the attack. To my amazement, Gardner and his men were marching straight across the open field between the bridge and Murphy's position in a perfect skirmish line, soaked and undeterred. I was stunned. I had given Gardner a mission-type order, assuming he would take a concealed approach. Instead, he was moving in a manner reminiscent of pickets at Gettysburg. As the Tigers advanced, they encountered heavy resistance. The enemy, part of the elite 95th NVA Regiment, had entrenched themselves skillfully along the hedgerows. The NVA opened up with a deadly fire, cutting down my Tigers across the open field. Those who survived charged the tree line through a hail of fire, displaying extraordinary bravery. I watched from my TAC CP, 40 yards away, as the scene unfolded, a chaotic mix of khaki, green, and scarlet. This was not guerrilla warfare as I had studied it. It was a new tactic of close-quarters combat, rendering our air and artillery support ineffective. Our enemy had voluntarily intermixed with American troops and fought tenaciously. The trap I had set with Bravo Company was not going to work, so I ordered Heiser to punch through the enemy's rear. One particular machine gun position, about 100 meters from our CP, was causing significant problems. As I spoke to the Tactical Air Forward Air Controller about neutralizing it, an Australian voice came over the radio. "I've got a Canberra light bomber here with 250-pound delays on board. Can you use them?" "Are you really accurate?" I asked. "I reckon," the Aussie pilot replied. The pilot conducted a dry run to assess the target and then carried out a live run, dropping bombs with incredible precision. Despite no direct hit, the damage was significant. The bunker's occupants, if not knocked unconscious, would be thoroughly battle-rattled. "How was that, mate?" the pilot asked after expending his ordnance. "Great, man. You saved our ass. Thanks a lot. Good hunting and good luck," I said, relieved. We then attempted to clear the position, but as soon as the men exposed themselves, they faced the same fierce machine gun fire from the bunker. The overwhelming firepower unleashed on the enemy should have been decisive, but it wasn't. Our air power, intended as the ultimate solution, proved insufficient against well-dug-in positions manned by determined fighters. The saturation bombing in North Vietnam seemed almost counterproductive. If air power couldn't effectively deal with entrenched positions despite the best efforts, it raised questions about its overall effectiveness. By now, the afternoon sun was waning. I was anxious about our lack of perimeter security and the challenges of medevac and resupply with darkness approaching. The day's trials had shown that bombing alone would not be the answer. We discovered a method to bring in helicopters without exposing them to direct enemy fire, which was a small victory in the chaos. However, the approaching darkness raised concerns about the accuracy required for the pilot's maneuvers. The instructions were specific. Go back one click, get on the deck, approach at 182 degrees, and land right on top of the smoke marker, avoiding the anti-aircraft machine guns. I was also worried about setting up for the night. B Company had faced heavy fighting and pulled back, leaving the Tigers and Murphy's men still engaged in the thick of it. As daylight dwindled, my patience with Gardner and the Tigers wore thin. I radioed Gardner, demanding immediate action. "God damn it, Jim. Get those positions cleaned out now. No more messing around. It's getting dark. Knock out those guns, and I mean now." I couldn't see what happened next, but Dennis Foley later relayed the story. Gardner took my orders to heart. He grabbed as many grenades as he could carry and ran up the trench alone. Under heavy fire, he threw a grenade into the first bunker, neutralizing it. He moved to the next bunker, where an enemy grenade was thrown back at him. Jim was hit, but continued his assault, throwing another grenade to shut down that gun. His courageous actions extended to a third position, where he destroyed another machine gun. Unfortunately, an enemy machine gun from yet another position hit him 4 times across the chest. Despite his injuries, Gardner reportedly said, "It's the best I can do," before he fell. Jim Gardner would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor for his heroism. Gardner's death was a crushing blow. Despite his valiant efforts, the Tigers were still pinned down, and they needed to break contact and link up with Murphy's forces to establish a defensive perimeter before nightfall. I moved as close as possible, separated only by a clear space in the village, and directed Dennis Foley to gather his men and move to my position. We would provide covering fire and artillery support. The Tigers manoeuvred across the open space under heavy fire, arriving miraculously intact. When Dennis joined us, Darrell and I were sheltered behind a downed coconut tree. Occasionally, pigs running around provided a grim reminder of the chaos. One pig, unfortunately, was caught in the crossfire. Foley had already been hit twice, once by a round that went through his jacket and once in his helmet, knocking off a lens. Throughout the battle, I had been coordinating helicopter resupplies. One of the recent lifts had carried a magazine reporter who, oblivious to the danger, approached our position in a yellow shirt and baseball cap. I pointed him towards the action, but went back to fighting. Moments later, I saw the reporter poking his head out to take photographs, only to be struck and killed by a bullet. As I dealt with the grim reality of war, an unknown helicopter pilot came on the radio. "Savvy Volley 5, this is Outlaw 53 inbound for resupply and passengers. Mark LZ over." "Outlaw 53, this is Savvy Volley 5. It's really hot down here, so I'll give you detailed instructions on how to get in," I began, but the pilot interrupted. "Savvy Volley 5, just tell me where you want me. Don't tell me how to do it, okay?" The situation was dire, but we were finding ways to adapt and survive amid the chaos. The helicopter pilot's refusal to follow my instructions led to a tragic outcome. Despite my warning, the chopper was hit by enemy fire, losing control and crashing. It was a grim spectacle, almost surreal in its slow-motion descent. Fortunately, no one was seriously hurt. Doug Holtz, the battalion support platoon leader, received a Purple Heart when a bullet grazed him. This was his 4th Purple Heart, yet he had survived with only minor injuries. The real loss was the $300,000 helicopter, destroyed by a few bullets and the pilot's overconfidence. As night fell, we secured a perimeter around the village, with Bravo Company setting up on the outskirts and the Tigers creating the best possible defense within the village. We focused on blocking the enemy's escape routes with artillery and mortars. Despite holding the village, the cost was heavy. The enemy casualties were high, but so were ours. 26 men dead and 28 wounded. The battle was a brutal lesson in the limitations of conventional tactics. The story of Bravo Company's fight was particularly disheartening. They had been ordered to attack across an open field, suffering heavy losses due to poor training and strategy. The infantry school's lessons on using concealed approaches had not translated into practice, resulting in devastating consequences. Gardner's and Heiser's experiences had not fully prepared them for the intense combat of the NVA, reflecting a broader issue in training and leadership. My own mistakes and the heavy casualties weighed heavily on me. The battle had been portrayed as a victory in official reports, but the reality was far grimmer. We had attacked machine gun positions head-on, reminiscent of World War I tactics, and paid a heavy price. Task Force Hackworth was disbanded, and the next morning the remnants of Bravo Company entered the village unopposed, as the NVA had withdrawn. When Colonel Rogers and the battalion staff arrived, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Among the arrivals was Dr. Raphael Benjamin, the battalion surgeon and a close friend. Raphael was someone I trusted deeply, both professionally and personally. He had joined the 101st Airborne to escape a mundane assignment and had quickly become a valuable companion. We shared meals, stories, and many nights in his aid station. Raphael, from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, had been drafted into the Army straight out of medical school. He was a brilliant, brave, and caring doctor, well loved by the troops. His perspective on the harsh realities of military life, contrasted with my own hardened view, had opened my eyes to the true impact of our experiences. Raphael's presence was a small comfort in the aftermath of such a devastating battle. Dr. Raphael Benjamin became one of the great teachers of my life, offering insights and perspectives I hadn't considered before. That night, just as we started discussing the recent battle, a firefight erupted on the east side of the perimeter. Flare lights, grenades, and blazing rifles filled the air. I shouted for the leaders to hold their fire, and gradually the weapons fell silent. Johnny Adams, the mortar platoon leader, reported that there had been heavy firing at our outpost and then into our perimeter. Raphael and I headed out to investigate, finding the outpost overrun and 2 soldiers gravely wounded. One of them had lost an arm, and Raphael and I struggled to get him back to safety. Despite our efforts, Raphael couldn't save him, and the other casualty was already dead when we returned. Raphael's frustration and sadness were palpable. He was usually calm and composed, but the situation had pushed him to his limits. Johnny Howard, one of our men, ventured into the darkness alone to search for the enemy. Although we didn't find a body the next morning, evidence of his encounter suggested he had been successful. I instructed all leaders to examine the scene of the attack as a stark reminder of the consequences of carelessness, emphasizing that smoking in the line or base camp during certain hours would not be tolerated. As operations in the Tu-Hoa area continued, Task Force Hackworth was re-established for a new mission. Colonel Rogers wanted additional experience on the team, so with Abu Company, a platoon of Tigers, and a CP group, we embarked on a stealthy operation. We moved on foot to avoid alerting the enemy, who would hear helicopters and flee before we arrived. For the next 5 days, there would be no resupply aircraft or communication with higher HQ, except for a daily report. The troops adapted quickly to the new rules, maneuvering silently through the forest. Even the wounded hobbled along, understanding the importance of maintaining stealth. I explained that we were sneaking up on the enemy, and they accepted the challenge with determination, inspired by the sense of purpose and the thrill of the hunt. For the first time since arriving in Vietnam, I truly felt the battlefield's deceptive quiet and the constant presence of the enemy. I became convinced that whenever a US unit was in the bush, an enemy reconnaissance element was always shadowing us, looking for weaknesses to report back to their unit. To test this theory, I buried an empty case of sea rations with a live frag grenade underneath, creating a decoy that would hopefully attract enemy attention. Our next move was to monitor how quickly the enemy would respond to our bait. This practical test, though dangerous, was crucial for understanding the enemy's tactics and improving our own strategies. The technique of using booby traps became a standard practice. We had an element place a decoy with a live grenade, and it successfully killed 2 Viet Cong soldiers. This tactic was a way to turn the tables on the enemy, who had often used our discarded supplies for their own traps. By having our troops police up and booby-trap everything, we gave the enemy a taste of their own medicine and found satisfaction in it. Another effective technique was to keep an ambush element in our vacated night positions. This approach paid off, drawing enemy fire and providing valuable intelligence. As Task Force Hackworth advanced, I could sense a significant confrontation approaching. The adrenaline was high with every step, and I knew we were nearing a critical point. During this period, our operations sergeant fell ill, and despite my limited medical knowledge, I suspected hepatitis based on the symptoms and a hard liver. I decided to medevac him, which meant our enemy would likely escape. I wrote a note to Dr. Raphael Benjamin, the battalion surgeon, explaining the situation. Unfortunately, Raphael diagnosed the sergeant with pneumonia, not hepatitis. This mistake was disheartening and made me reconsider my involvement in medical matters, focusing instead on soldiering. The TUHOA mission became a turning point in refining our combat tactics. I sought to improve our approach and reduce casualties by integrating lessons from various sources, including Bernard Fall's Street Without Joy and insights from Special Forces personnel. Colonel Rogers was receptive to new ideas, and we began experimenting with different strategies. We adopted the practice of infiltrating small units into the bush at night, forming small perimeters, and using patrols to search for the enemy. This approach, inspired by Australian methods and successful in earlier conflicts, involved decentralizing operations and relying on small, agile patrols rather than large formations. The nighttime patrols proved invaluable for interdicting enemy routes and maintaining a tactical advantage. Despite the benefits of these new techniques, convincing young leaders to adopt them was challenging. After the intense experiences at Myan, enthusiasm for aggressive tactics waned, and there was a noticeable shift in the attitude of the troops. Nevertheless, the lessons learned during these operations contributed significantly to evolving our strategies and improving our effectiveness in the field. The intensity of the war was becoming clearer to everyone, and slowly the men began to understand their enemy better and develop the patience needed to fight effectively. Miss Vin's unexpected visit was a rare and welcomed break from the harsh realities of combat. She had come to see me, having heard that I was in Hoa. Although our time together was brief and surrounded by the constant threat of VC activity, it was a moment of solace and connection amidst the chaos. Back in the field, the war continued to evolve. The approach of incorporating small, decentralized patrols and ambushes proved successful. These techniques, adapted from Australian methods and experiences, allowed us to maintain pressure on the enemy and better manage our resources. General Pearson's inquiry about our operations with the Australians revealed that my decisions had caught the attention of higher command. It was Pat Graves, one of our standout officers, who had inadvertently brought this to light. His commendable actions and the recognition he received from the Australians had reached General Westmoreland, which put me in a difficult position. Despite being reprimanded and forced to suspend our collaboration with the Aussies for the remainder of my tour, I recognized the irony in the situation. The very tactics and methods that had proved effective and garnered praise were now causing complications at higher levels. This experience underscored the challenges of balancing innovative tactics with the constraints of higher command and the broader military strategy. Pat Graves's contributions, including his observations and writings, were significant. His insights and experiences became valuable resources for other officers, and his dedication and heroism set him apart. Despite the setbacks, the lessons learned and the strategies developed during this time would continue to influence our approach to combat and leadership. I was told Westy had deep-sixed the cross-training idea because it wouldn't have looked good from a public relations angle to have the Australians nursing the Screaming Eagles along. But from a public relations angle, what could have been more perfect than to have a 101 guy picking up the chips for the bagger Aussies? The people of Hoa successfully completed their rice harvest, and the 101 turned its attention to the jungles and mountains in the surrounding area. The next 10 days or so were singularly uneventful until the morning of the 4th of March, when I saw an old Viet gentleman walking toward the battalion perimeter. Australian John Essex Clark always said that the Americans put too much stock in electronic intelligence gathering rather than feeling the pulse on the ground, so I told RS2 Lieutenant Jerry Nakashima to go talk to the guy and see if he knew anything. The old man told Jerry he'd just seen men from the north wearing khaki and carrying long stovepipes moving toward the village. The only reasonable interpretation of this was that a North Vietnamese unit carrying large mortars was setting up in a village to our southwest. But the question then was whether the old vet was for real, a setup, a VC supporter, or perhaps just an innocent old man whose family was being held hostage by the NVA to lead us into a trap. In either case, this kind of volunteered information was a typical enemy ploy. In assessing it, the only thing I had going for me was my instinct and the quaint way the Viet described what he'd seen, which made me feel he was telling the truth. I gave Colonel Rogers the intelligence and the circumstances in which we got it. He swung A and B companies, which were just returning home from another operation, toward TH Poo on separate axes. By the time we'd organised our task forces, the Colonel decided to tag along with A, while I went with B Company. Bravo had already made contact just outside the village hamlet of Fighting Myu. The subsequent fighting in and around Mai Fu was vicious. What seemed at first to be light fire from a squad-size enemy element soon became heavy automatic weapons fire from an enemy force of 2 to 3 companies. For a moment it seemed we'd been lured in. The enemy was fighting from well-dug and fortified positions, just as they had at Myan. But all was not as it appeared. When I landed in the middle of B Company's fight, one of the first things I saw was an NVA company running around like headless chickens. We'd caught them on the move, a fact confirmed later in the day by a P, who added that the NVA unit's intention had been to set up mortar positions to blast our firebase while hitting us with a 3-company ground attack. The old vet had been right. B Company was fully engaged, kicking ass but also taking casualties. Even though they'd been surprised, the NVA's SOP went on the move to always have pre-dug defensive positions for just such a contingency, which diminished our initial advantage. One of Bravo's medics took a slug in the back of his head. Raphael, who was on the ground treating the wounded the whole time, didn't think he'd make it, but felt it was worth a try. Together, we dragged the medic along the ground in a poncho to a safer spot. Safer in this fight was relative. Across the battle area, you couldn't lift your head without drawing fire. I called for a medevac, and instantly a chopper was on the scene. Its pilot asked for landing instructions. "Look, it's really hot down here," I told him. "You're going to have to volunteer for this one, because you may not make it out." "Just tell me how to do it," he replied. I told him what I thought the best route would be, and the pilot followed my instructions to the letter. As the chopper landed, Raphael and I rushed the wounded medic to the open door. The chopper crew chief grabbed him and pulled him inside. Slugs were buzzing and snapping around the chopper like flies in a slaughterhouse. As I turned to thank the pilot, only then did I find this was no ordinary airplane driver, but Major Dave George, a dear old 8th Div friend of mine, and rival from the Fort Benning career course days. We shook hands and started catching up on old times over the din of his helicopter, completely forgetting we were on the battlefield. It was probably the only reason neither of us got hit. "You've won me for life, stud," I told him as he prepared to carry the wounded away, that it was the first of many medevac runs that Goodman and his brave crew would make to Myu. Enemy dead were strewn all over the hamlet. Heiser and the men of Bravo had learned well at Myan and Mai Fu. They did not assault fixed positions. Instead, they hunkered down and let firepower dig the enemy out. Still, in the wake of their casualties and in the fog of battle, I wasn't sure who had the upper hand. All that changed when I saw one young black trooper firing like fury down a wide ditch with an M79. I raced over to see that he'd killed about 30 NVA soldiers single-handedly. Such carnage in such a small section of the battlefield was a picture that said everything to me. Suddenly, I knew we had a solid victory on our hands. Meanwhile, a company had taken 7 casualties in an attempt to come to our assistance and encircle the enemy forces. Over the radio, Colonel Rogers, who had gone airborne in his C&C to get a look at the whole fight, told me he thought we should break off. "No, sir," I said. "We've got to capitalize on this. We've got the enemy on the ropes. We're winning this one." "I agree with Hack," said General Pearson, who was monitoring our net from his bird above the battlefield. The 2 commanders then decided that because I was on the ground, I should take command of the engaged troops. It was another lucky break, but it was almost nipped in the bud when, a short time later, Raphael, Darrell and I were leaning against the blown-out wall of a house, and an enemy machine gun opened up right at us. How the gunner managed to stitch the wall between Darrell and me, and then move on to stitch between me and Raphael without hitting any of us, was a miracle or a fluke beyond belief. But that was exactly what happened. Of course, we immediately shagged out of there. It wasn't a very cool place to be. The battle began to settle down to a slow, methodical, inch-by-inch finding of the enemy's dug-in positions and one by one destroying them. Just as dark was coming on, Abu's company commander, Hal Eaton, staggered into our position. It was very strange. He came out of nowhere and had to have walked from a company straight through the NVA positions to get there. But we quickly found out how he'd done it. He was in shock, having taken grenade fragments in his throat. Only then did I get the full story on Abu's casualties. They were staggering. Not one officer of the 3 rifle platoons remained. All had been killed or wounded, with the greatest shock of all being word that Harry the Horse Godwin was dead. At dark, the Abu Weapons Platoon, which was fighting as a rifle platoon and had been held as such in battalion reserve throughout the day, infiltrated the battle area and linked up with the remnants of its company. Bob Press, Abu's first sergeant, who had actually hit a mine the previous day but had chosen to stay with his unit when it was redirected towards Thonu, took command of the company. I radioed Harry the Horse's platoon and spoke with Staff Sergeant Travis Martin, the only officer left, and asked him if he thought he could run Harry's platoon for the night. "You bet, sir," the squad leader replied. "I've been training for a situation like this for 10 years. I directed a company to get themselves squared away along the enemy's escape route to the south. Bravo, meanwhile, consolidated its positions along the escape route to the west. As both companies evacuated their casualties, I knew we desperately needed more men on the ground. With C Company off on a brigade mission, all I had as reserves were the Taipei Tigers, who'd spent the fight so far securing our firebase, a stupid damn job for them anyway. I decided to bring them in. "What about my security?" the artillery battery CO screamed through the radio when I gave him the word. "I need the infantry to secure me." "Well, you're not going to have them tonight," I replied. "Look at your TO and E statement, young captain. It says you are capable of defending yourself, so let's see you do it." Denying the artillery its security was far less a concern to me than eliminating my reserve, but I was convinced we were soundly trouncing the enemy. What I wanted now was to get as many escape routes blocked as we could, then blow the hell out of the centre of the NVA positions and catch the enemy troops with infantry ambushes as they scurried for safety. Through my own experience, and as it meshed with what I'd read of the French experience, as well as the views of the old Indochina Hands and what Emerson was doing in the O2, I was concluding that this was the way to fight the NVA and the VC. The ammo was free. Only the taxpayer paid for that, and it made a lot more sense than trying to close with our hardcore opponent, as we had at Myan, and suffer excessive casualties. The Tigers were inserted at 2100 hours in the brigade's first nighttime airmobile assault. They moved into their multiple ambush positions without casualties, despite being under fire from the moment. They stepped out of the choppers at their one-bird LZ. Throughout the night, the Tigers were responsible for about a dozen NVA stragglers killed. Unfortunately, though predictably, many NVA escaped through our far too open net and bugged back to the hills. Come the early dawn, Darrell Nunnally and I left B Company, where we'd spent the night, and moved out to Abu's position. With us was the redoubtable Tom Hancock, who would replace the wounded Hal Eaton as the company commander. To appreciate how the tragic events of the 4th of March affected the men of Abu Company, it is necessary to understand the Abu spirit and history. The Abus had actually evolved from another unit, the IBUs, Item Company 187 RCT. As the story went, in 1952, the companies of the 187th decided that rather than use standard military phonetics, for example Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, to identify themselves, they would give themselves names. Animals seemed to be the order of the day. L Company became Lion, M Company became Mighty Moose, and so on. But poor Item found the only animal that began with an I was a wading bird called an ibis, which just wouldn't do. It was Item Company's commander, Captain Robert Chan Nan, who came up with the mythical EBU, an acronym for I is the best unit. All that was needed then was to decide what this never-before-seen creature looked like. Remarkably, the task was accomplished in a very short time. The EBU had a gorilla's body, a lion's head, moose's horns, and an alligator's tail. It wore a parachute and jump boots, and clutched a pistol in its right hand and a knife dripping blood in its left. The EBU proliferated quickly, finding its way onto guidons, company signs, swagger sticks, an ivory EBU on one end and an ivory jump boot on the other, and the legs of many an IBU NCO in the form of a tattoo that stretched virtually from ankle to knee. When the 10th was reactivated in 1956, the 3rd Battalion 187th RCT, of which IBU was a part, was incorporated into the Pentomic Battle Group. Instead of gracefully bowing out, the fierce EBU of yesteryear just changed its name to ABU to accommodate its new company designation. For old-timers and newcomers alike, the legend of the EBU was the glue that cemented the men of A Company together. At Fort Campbell, a good number of ABU's NCOs had been with the company since its early IBU days. Even with rotation and normal attrition in Vietnam, on the 4th of March, many original ABUs, like First Sergeant Bob Press, who started out as a squad leader in 1956, remained. Unlike Bravo Company, which had its baptism of fire in February, the fine, cocky troopers of ABU had not seen a major battle in Vietnam before Mu. Their losses, 13 KIA and almost 40 WIA, knocked the remaining members for one serious loop. The shock was compounded by the death of the indestructible Harry the Horse. If Harry died, the company's collective thought seemed to be, how could any of the poor mortals among them survive? The unit's morale had not just been damaged, it had been destroyed, or so it appeared. When we arrived at their position, a rice paddy in the centre of which were ABU's dead, neatly stacked row on row and covered with ponchos, I was quietly briefed on the events of the previous day. On Hal Eaton's order, ABU's 3rd platoon had assaulted across a dry rice paddy and taken 11 WIA in less than 50 yards, with 6 more lost when they attempted to advance over a dike on My Phu's perimeter. Harry Godwin's 2nd platoon had attacked across another open paddy, this one 75 yards long, with absolutely no cover or concealment. The strength of the platoon had gone from 35 to 8 men before they were halfway across, with the weapons squad suffering 100% casualties. Among the KIA were Harry the Horse, who'd led the attack, and his RTO, Reuben Sweet Daddy Garnett. The story went that Harry fell first, and when Sweet Daddy automatically went to his aid, he was dropped by the same gun that had killed his friend. Sweet Daddy was holding Harry's hand when he died. So far from home, the bond of love and friendship these two men shared in life and death transcended the separate worlds they'd known in America. Harry Godwin was a dyed-in-the-wool Southerner, and Reuben Garnett, a black man born and raised in the ghettos of Philadelphia. The ABU survivors sat dazed and defeated, hunkered down behind rice paddy walls. I knew I had to get them back on their horses immediately, or they'd never ride again. "So you guys have taken your lumps," I began, and proceeded to remind them of who they were, the ABUs, the best, and what ABU and the US Army paratrooper were all about. Then I tore their collective arse for violating the basics, which had led to all their problems in the first place. First Sergeant Press later told me that the whole speech had been good news, especially to the older NCOs who had been trying to get their platoon to act and react tactically as they'd been trained, rather than taking on all the bad habits sanctioned by the most recent company commander who had brought his gung-ho, ultra-aggressive bad habits from his last unit, the 173rd Airborne. I must have begun my speech squatted down near the troopers and then stood up and started walking around, because suddenly a sergeant called out, "Get down, sir! There's a machine gun in that house," referring to a substantial stone structure in the village behind us. Damn, a lot of machine guns. I replied and marched over to the paddy wall beyond which stood the house. Turning to the men, I asked, "Who's going with me?" I hopped over the wall and started moving toward the house, using paddy walls as a concealed and covered approach. I was damn scared. I didn't want to go like Jim Gardet. However, since I'd gone through the village with Darrell and Hancock on my way to Abu's position and hadn't seen a single live enemy, I figured the odds had to be on my side. Besides, the exercise was worth it, if only to set an example and make the men grab hold of their bootstraps and pull themselves up. Some NCOs were already doing so. About a dozen had followed me over the first paddy wall. When I got to the side of the house, I threw a grenade through the window, then jumped up and hosed down the dead crew inside. I then formed a skirmish line of the troopers who joined me for a sweep through the village. I was the end man, moving along a paddy wall. We hadn't gone very far when I saw a sudden movement on my right. Out of a spider hole popped an NVA soldier holding a rifle in one hand and a grenade in the other. The guy was about to throw the grenade in front of the skirmish line. I could see there was no way I'd be able to spin my rifle around fast enough to stop him, so I just dropped my weapon and tackled the guy. I threw his grenade away and dragged him out of his hole. He was wounded, probably from the previous day's fight, and I turned him over to press with instructions to get a chopper to evacuate him to Brigade HQ and make damn sure no one killed him in the meantime. The Abu boys weren't butchers, but after what they'd been through, the passion for revenge would naturally be high. Hancock and I personally counted 118 dead NVA troops on the ground at NYU before I left him to his new command. He was a good choice as skipper, as competent an officer as he was a sergeant, and the ideal guy to charge up the Abus. Having been a Company XO both at Fort Campbell and in the early Vietnam days, Hancock was a solid choice. Unfortunately for all concerned, Hancock was not so lucky on the battlefield. Less than 24 hours after he took command of the Abus, he was evacuated to the States with his hand badly wounded in the mortar attack on our firebase. The 95th NVA, our opponents at Myu, as they'd been at Myan, went ahead with the same plan one of the PS had outlined. Despite the beating we'd given them the day before, Hancock was gone. Captain Wayne Dill, a replacement from the 82nd and a brave, solid soldier who was not afraid to tell the boss what he thought, became Abu's new commander. No sooner had I left the Abus than I received a radio message to return to brigade immediately. I got in a chopper and headed for Tu Hoa, where I was met by General Pearson in his clean, starched fatigues. I, on the other hand, was filthy from head to toe with a 2-day scruffy beard to boot. "General Westmoreland would like you to brief him on yesterday's battle," Pearson said. "Shouldn't I change clothes or shave, sir?" "No, you're just perfect. You look just great," Pearson replied. He escorted me to the briefing tent, and I told Westmoreland about the fight. I felt we'd acquitted ourselves well, though the casualties we'd suffered were still far too high for the result. While we'd caught the enemy on the move, they had been able to take advantage of their already established dug-in positions. By not specifically restraining Abu, Colonel Rogers and I had allowed them to attack right into the buzzsaw with typical airborne aggressiveness. Naturally, I did not tell any of this to General Westmoreland. He got just the highlights. When I finished, he said, "You have done a good job, and you're to be congratulated. It sounds as if you've pretty well mauled a VC battalion. Now they're groggy, and you've got to keep after them, which I presume is your plan." "Yes, sir," I replied. The briefing over, I headed for the door, only to be stopped by a final congratulations from the theatre commander. "Well done, Major," he said, and then added, "Now you've just got to pursue. "Yes, sir," I said, pursuing the thought as I walked out of the tent. Did he really mean he wanted us to charge into the woods and get our asses torn apart by the enemy's inevitable delaying screen of snipers and booby traps? In World War II, there were numerous cases of one sniper stopping a rifle battalion for hours, killing and wounding dozens of soldiers in the process. Did Westmoreland really want us to make that investment in lives here in Vietnam for so little return? Surely not. This was not the same kind of war as World War II. This was not a war of terrain objectives, a fact I'd come to appreciate the hard way at Myan. Each objective was worth the price in lives if, in taking it, you moved closer to your final objective, your Berlin, Tokyo, or Pyongyang. Vietnam was a war where, more often than not, our elusive enemy just went to ground or ran away, while we swept through and cleared a village only for it to be rebuilt and reoccupied the minute we'd moved on. Myan was a classic example. 21 of our men were dead in a battle for a piece of real estate that elements of the battalion, even a company itself, had searched a number of times in the weeks previous to the 4th of March fight. Unlike World War II, where, in just one example, 10,000 US Marines were stacked up on the beaches of Iwo Jima in 4 hours because we needed that island to construct an airbase to bomb Japan and end the war. In Vietnam, at Myan, 21 of our men were dead in a battle for a piece of real estate that had no strategic or tactical value, and that would be abandoned by our pursuing forces as soon as the dust settled. I left Myan feeling as I had after Myan. There must be a better, less expensive way to fight these sons of guns. The whole Tu Hoa experience led to a significant shift in my tactical thinking. I recognized my error at Myan. I had fought the battle by automatic reflex based on my previous combat experience. With everything happening so fast, it hadn't occurred to me that my second-nature reactions might be wrong. I fought the battle as I would have in Korea. Hal Moore had fought Ia Drang like Korea too, but in his case it had been a Korea-style battle. The NVA attacked the Cav in waves, not unlike the Chinese had attacked us in the winter of 50 and the spring of 51. In my case, I had a mission to relieve a besieged unit. I deployed my men with one element blocking in case the enemy broke and ran, which was what he was supposed to do. The other's job was to roll up the enemy's flank. It was a sound employment of forces for a set-piece battle, except that Myan had not been a set-piece battle. The enemy's disposition had not been well defined. He had no flanks per se, and his discreet, unorthodox positions, brilliantly concealed and fortified, had not exactly been conducive to being rolled up. My brain had automatically told me that to relieve Murphy's unit, I'd have to take the village where the men were besieged. I fought for a terrain objective, which the student of guerrilla warfare in me knew was not the way to fight this war, but which the career-seasoned warrior in me did not have time to remember. Drawing on the Myan experience and the subsequent weeks of fighting that culminated in Myan, as the Tu Hoa mission drew to a close, I began to advocate more small-scale patrols for the battalion and more night operations to steal the darkness from the enemy who had until then moved freely through it. Emerson would be the first to conduct a full-scale battalion-sized nighttime airmobile assault. Never again would I let the night hamper me as it had at Myan. This was a result of my career experience, which demanded that a unit consolidate, dig in, and prepare for an attack with the coming of darkness. I realized, too, that the presence of a large enemy element should not be the green light for a full-scale assault by our men. After all, what had caused the carnage at Tu Hoa were the heroic airborne charges. Tu Hoa proved to me once and for all that paratroopers were innately unfit for guerrilla warfare, even Phase 2 battalion and regiment-sized guerrilla warfare. So were Marines, of whom Harry the Horse had been one before he joined the 101st. Both types of warriors were trained for shock action to violently close with the enemy, destroy him, and then return to a rear area to regroup, refit, train, and wait for the next mission. Both were eager, motivated, and aggressive, admirable characteristics in a conventional war, but on a guerrilla battlefield they became too eager, too motivated, and too aggressive. Both airborne and Marines were determined, but had no patience. They were always long on guts, but sometimes short on brains. After Tu Hoa, I also realized that despite my attitude toward decentralized command and mission-type orders, there were times when issuing more exacting instructions to my paratrooper unit was absolutely essential to get the job done right with minimal casualties. The main lesson I learned at Tu Hoa was that there was simply no point in taking an objective you had no intention of holding. There was no point in using men when firepower could do the job. Tu Hoa's battlefields might have looked like the hedgerows of Normandy, But if, as was the case, the taking of such objectives one by one wasn't ultimately going to lead you anywhere, and if, as was also the case, you were going to abandon each objective after taking it, only to take it again and abandon it again and again, as the French did before us and as we were doing now, well, it wasn't worth the life of even a single soldier. I learned just after Meaux that Colonel Rogers finished his 6-month command tour. Battalion commanders had 6 months, and company commanders had 3, just long enough to figure out what they didn't know. Our replacement, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Minen, had been away from troops for a long time. Fortunately, I was to stay on as the XO to provide continuity in the battalion. Not long after this change of command, word came from NHA Trang that John Howard, who was hospitalized there with malaria, was to be evacuated to the States. This came as a hell of a blow to me because I loved the guy and to the battalion because he was such a damn fine officer. Though I'd once put him on ice in the S3 shop to keep him alive after Jim Gardner was killed, I'd sent him to the Tigers. He had wanted more action, and the unit had needed him. Since I had a few logistical things to take care of and not try anyway, Raphael and I decided to use the trip as a little R&R and visit Johnny in the hospital. Apparently, our young friend was one sick hombre, but in Raphael's expert opinion, he looked pretty good when we arrived. So we persuaded Dr. Barton Blackbart, a friend of Raphael's, and one of the hospital doctors, to let us take Johnny out for a temporary holiday, just to sit in the sun at the beach and enjoy himself. Blackbart wasn't exactly convinced when we promised that Johnny wouldn't drink or eat the wrong foods, and that we'd have him back in his hospital bed by 1800 hours. But because Raphael was a doctor, and a damn good one at that, he gave us the nod. We really did mean to keep our word, but we kind of got sidetracked when we hit the first of the NHA Trang clubs. By 1800, we were drunk enough to forget to take Johnny back to the hospital. Instead, we stumbled over to LEF Treat, an open-air restaurant that Johnny promptly and at the top of his lungs renamed Rick's American Cafe. We drank and ate the richest food on the menu, and despite the fact that Johnny grew greener by the second, good trooper that he was, he still got up on a table in the middle of the club and began his Rudyard Kipling recitation. A few less than romantic souls kept interrupting him until we threatened to clunk their heads together. Johnny soldiered on, orating eloquently as he swayed from sickness and booze, until he got knocked in the head by a whirling ceiling fan and fell off the table. I think that's when we decided to take him back. Blackbart was in a rage when we dragged his patient back to his hospital bed. Besides the fact that we hadn't kept our end of the bargain, we had unknowingly triggered such a relapse in Johnny's condition that for the next couple of days the docs thought he was going to die. He didn't, thank God, but they contemplated court-martialing him for abusing his government-issued body. Fortunately, that didn't come to pass either, and he was soon sent home where he fully recovered. Johnny would return to Vietnam to distinguish himself at the 1972 Battle of An Loc, and subsequently go on to become a brigadier general. A few days later, my other Tiger platoon leader, Dennis Foley, got a NHA Trang R&R of his own, thanks to the battalion's policy that a wounded trooper, wherever he was, had to be paid on payday just like his buddies, and he had to be paid by one of his own officers. Dennis was on his way to NHA Trang. This SOP was good not just for the soldiers' morale, but also for the officers. An unwritten rule was that after the hospital visit, the rest of the day and night were his. Foley planned to take full advantage of it. He went to NHA Trang almost directly from the field, unshaved and unwashed in his distinctive Tiger Force fatigues. After he paid the troops, he planned to clean himself up and head over to Marie Kim's, a favourite Screaming Eagle's watering hole, for some relaxation. As he headed up the street from the hospital, an OD Army sedan with 2 stars on the bumper pulled up beside him. General Larson, the IV Corps commander, opened the door and stuck his head out. "What are you doing in town, Lieutenant?" "I came to pay the troops," Dennis replied. "Got a place to stay tonight?" the general asked. "Not yet, sir." "Well, hop in," Larson said. Dennis didn't have much choice. He got into the sedan and they drove off. Larson, who loved the 101st, had recognized Foley's tiger fatigues and took the chance encounter to get a first-hand report on how we were doing. The two men chatted in the car, and before long they arrived at Larson's quarters, a stately old French villa. A valet showed Foley to his bedroom for the night and pointed out the bathroom. The valet brought him a drink, and Dennis took a shower. But by the time he got back to the bedroom, all his clothes were gone. In their place was a set of General Larson's fatigues, complete with stars embroidered on the jacket. "Put these on," said the valet. "We're washing yours." Dennis didn't have much choice, and before long the second lieutenant in the Major General's gear was having cocktails with the genuine article in the dining room of the villa. Drinks led to dinner, dinner led to coffee, and coffee led to adjournment into another room for cognac and cigars. War stories flowed throughout. It was an extraordinary event, but for Dennis the experience was double-edged. Few lieutenants would ever dream of spending a pleasant evening at home with their commanding general. But on the other hand, Dennis had been dreaming of getting laid ever since he'd left Tu Hoa, and the general just wouldn't let him go. Larson was like a lonely prisoner in his own headquarters, a major general without a Berlin or Tokyo to capture, stuck in a job with nothing to do. As the long night turned into morning, Dennis knew he'd lost, if not his chance, then at least his options at Marie Kim's. He finally excused himself by saying he had to get some sleep and had an early plane to catch. "I'll have my driver take you over to the airport," Larson volunteered. Any hope Dennis had of grabbing a morning quickie evaporated in an instant. Foley went back to his bedroom to find his tiger uniform newly washed, pressed and starched, and his boots polished. Just as he began undressing for the night, one of Larson's aides appeared at the door. "The general has retired for the evening," the aide said. "He asked me to pass on to you that if there's any place you need to go or anything you want to do before you retire, please feel free to do so. You'll find a driver and a car outside, and one of us will be here to let you in whenever you return." So, while Larson may have been a hell of a general, but he was also a soldier's soldier. The 1st Brigade received a well-earned valorous unit citation for the Tu Hoa operations, and the battalion got a separate one for My Phu. VCs weren't easy to come by, so both brigade and battalion were incredibly proud. For my guys, though, the experience at Tu Hoa meant a lot more. The soldiers had begun to get hard, not just physically but mentally, where it really counted. After 8 months in Vietnam, they had dealt with death and seen it in numbers none could have imagined. They'd endured leeches, jungle rot, constant heavy rains, and clammy clothes that chilled them in their sleep. The wait-a-minute bushes could hold a trooper as tenaciously as a strand of barbed wire. Many fought malaria and hepatitis, and all fought fear, not just of the enemy but of the snakes, the tigers of the Central Highlands that reportedly pounced on troopers, and the monkeys that dropped out of trees at night like stealthy Viet Cong. At least one of these was hacked to death by a trooper with a machete in the dark. And of course, the night itself. Through it all they'd learned, and little by little exchanged bravado for real confidence. Everyone did, if they stayed long enough. Even the pilots like Outlaw 53, who had insisted on having his chopper blasted out of the sky at Mai Can, changed. I met him again 4 months later at a big party we threw in celebration of the battalion's brilliantly fought end-of-tour graduation exercise, the Battle of DTOE. When Outlaw 53 heard one of my guys call me Savvy Volley 5, he came over to introduce himself and tell me that as a result of our last encounter, he'd left his know-it-all, God's gift to aviation days behind. That same evening, many other pilots came up and introduced themselves as White Eagle 4, Splendid Horse 2, or whatever their call signs were, mentioning the operations where we'd served together. It wasn't too often the guys on the ground met the men who supported them, and vice versa. We were all generally just voices on the radio, so there was an immediate camaraderie among us and a lot of mutual respect too. We looked in awe at the pilots for the amazing risks they took in our support, particularly in evacuating wounded soldiers. The pilots treated us infantry guys as if we were Wyatt Earp and his gunfighters in the old Tombstone Bar, the ones who dished it out and had to take it the hard way. In a high-tech world, the pilots somehow made their helicopters a romantic symbol of a bygone era. They rode those choppers as if they were their horses in the old cavalry or cowboy days, coming in guns blazing and swooping down over the battlefield to save the day with their tremendous mobility and firepower. Unfortunately, the feeling of power most chopper drivers felt could work both for the infantry and against us. Over-enthusiastic pilots sometimes got a little carried away, firing first and only then ascertaining whether the target was friend or foe. This developed in the infantry a definite ambivalence toward the flyers and their gallant steeds. But like a lot of relationships, love-hate or otherwise, if it were all weighed up, we wouldn't have dreamed of letting them go. While the Screaming Eagle Fire Brigade moved to the coastal town of Phan Thiet to prepare for battle, in what intelligence reports indicated was a large Viet Cong stronghold somewhere along the nearby Vietnamese 2nd and 3rd Corps boundary, I prepared to go on R&R. "Raphael," I said to Doc Benjamin, who was going as well, "organise us a kit, pills for every possible contingency. If we get malaria, we've got to cure it for 5 days. Hepatitis, cure it for 5 days. The runs, VD, anything. I don't want to miss one stroke on this R&R. We arrived in Hong Kong, and each of us got a suite at the Hilton. In mine, I filled the tub with hot water and bubble bath, rang room service, and ordered champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Neither Raphael nor I had any civilian gear in Hong Kong, but everything was beautifully and instantly made to order and cheap as hell. So we spent our first wad of dough on clothes in duplicate, triplicate, or by the dozen. Raphael wanted to go out and buy some stuff for his wife, and I decided that whatever he got for Karen, I'd get for Patty. We bought mink stoles and diamond rings. It didn't hurt that the night before we left Vietnam, I'd gotten into a poker game at the NHA Trang Officers Club and won almost a 5-figure bundle of free money to round out my Hong Kong kit bag. We bought beaded sweaters and beaded purses, and finished off the spree by buying ourselves each a gold Rolex watch. At that time, a mere couple of months' pay, we probably spent $6,000 each on the very first day. But what the hell? We were there, we were having fun, and we were alive. What else mattered? Upon returning to the brigade base camp at Phan Rang, I was informed I needed to report to Brigade Forward at Phan Thiet ASAP. Lieutenant Colonel Melvin Garton, Colorado, had been badly wounded when a VC mine blew his jeep to hell and back. He'd taken a severe hit in the leg and shrapnel in the head. It was a terrible waste of a World War II DSC winner, bearer of a perfect attendance 3-war CIB, an all-around brilliant soldier, and a hell of a combat commander. Garton had breathed fire into the previously sluggish second to none, renaming it the No Slack Battalion and cutting no slack until the unit shaped up. It was just beginning to come into its own as a great-spirited outfit when Garton was hit. His loss was felt all the way down the chain of command. Fortunately, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Wasco, the brigade XO and another fine long-time airborne man, had been sent up to the battalion to take Garton's place and continue his good work. The reason I had to report to Phan Thiet ASAP was that I was to replace Colonel Wasco. The brigade XO was the third most senior person in the brigade, right behind General Pearson and his deputy colonel Ted Maxis. The position generally went to a senior lieutenant colonel, of which there were a number in the 101st, and I was only a major. General Pearson's decision immediately put me in a very difficult position, just as in the Vanguards, where Colonel Newbreed had catapulted me over his senior majors, and Colonel Sniffen to become his deputy for the ATT. Now I was in charge of a staff where almost everyone outranked me. Army officers being keenly aware of such things as date of rank and the attendant pecking order, there was a lot of resentment among the staff. This was compounded by the fact that their new boss was the one they had sniped at and complained about continually during the octopus days, the one who refused to play their paper-pushing game at the battalion level. Still, the irony of it all was wonderful, and even I was surprised at how diplomatic I was in my initial letter of instruction to these no-good pricks who were suddenly showering me with love and affection. Some of you, I know from experience, do everything you can to help the units. Some of us have the attitude that the units are here to make our job easier. Our responsibility is to do everything possible to help the battalions and the individual companies. No one on the staff will say no to a subordinate unit, only the general will say no. The friction eased pretty quickly, or maybe I just stopped noticing it. General Pearson was a damned efficient paper man, and from day one I was too busy burning the midnight oil to stay ahead of the old man to get involved in staff politics. Pearson was a high-intellect kind of guy, more a staff man than a commander. He drove his people hard, perhaps as a result of his own iron self-discipline. He had taken a memory course and, henceforth, never forgot a thing. He could fall asleep in an instant and wake up fully rested 10 minutes later. He was a no-nonsense man who hurried his briefers along with a next point that cracked like an M1 rifle. He was ruthless in a quiet way, but a strong supporter of those who served him well. Though he lacked the showmanship that electrified the troops, Pearson was knowledgeable and fair, and the perfect general for the war in Vietnam, which was a battalion, not a brigade commander's war. An exception to this was when a brigade commander was a romping, stomping warrior type with an aerial feel for on-the-ground battle. Then the war could be a brigade CO's war, but Pearson generally stood back from the action. He ran his unit more like a division than a brigade, but in the 101st this suited his romping, stomping warrior-type battalion subordinates just fine. The way it really shook out was that O2 Commander Hank Emerson was the tactical brains of the brigade, and I was his assistant. We were both innovators who bounced ideas off each other. The quality of these ideas was often propelled by the competitive spirit we shared, a clean and comfortable competition based on abiding mutual respect. We'd sell them to Pearson, and if an idea really worked, the general would implement it across the board in the brigade. Somehow this created great rapport among us, Hank and I, the sometimes crude, always maverick warriors, and Pearson, a man with the dedication and spirit of a modern-day Cromwell. As straight as they come, yet able to look the other way when necessary, as he had when he saw the millions of tents in the battalion area, or when he found out about my unauthorized Australian connection. When it came to Hank, Pearson knew that having Emerson on his team was like having a Cadillac, albeit an extremely tall, gangly, hook-nosed Cadillac in the garage. Hank Emerson was one of the most unlikely-looking warriors one could ever imagine, but he was a winner, a brave, inspiring leader whom Pearson knew better than to play musical chairs with. By the time the battalion left Phan Thiet, the gunfighter had been with the outfit for 8 months. With his own gushing enthusiasm, he'd built a great-spirited unit from the ashes of Yalta the previous September. Now, as the brigade moved on to the bamboo labyrinth of Nong Thon to begin operations, the O2 and its leaders stood poised for their finest hour with the 101st Brigade. Hank's boldness and combat savvy, coupled with his troops' total professionalism, would turn a potential massacre into the very model of how to fight this war. But there was still one thing to be learned from Phan Thiet. The Phan Thiet operation ended not much differently than it had begun. Nothing happened, at least in the first week. One funny encounter had a Tiger or Recondo long-range reconnaissance patrol bursting into a VC training camp in the middle of a class on Beware of American Long-Range Patrols. But in the second week, after combing the area side by side with ARVN, regional forces, popular forces, RF, PF, and other friendly Viet elements, probably 5,000 men in all, with only light and minor contact, the only thing the 1st Brigade discovered was that the intelligence had been wrong. The VC did not have a huge redoubt on the 2nd and 3rd Corps boundary in that area after all. So the Fire Brigade picked up again, and as XO, I was responsible for kicking the brigade out. Our security perimeter got smaller and smaller as one battalion, and then another took off in C-130 Hercules aircraft. As the support elements left, the ARA shrank even more. Just because it couldn't have been done any other way didn't make it any less precarious for the men left on the ground or any more comforting. Finally, only a few vehicles and some 25 or 30 people, the team involved with coordinating and executing the move, were left on the ground. ARVN was in the area for security, but since I'd learned early never to depend on them, I was damn anxious to get us all out of there. Finally, our aircraft arrived. Equipment was stacked on jeeps, driven in and tied down. All of us got on board, and soon the plane turned around and took off. Just as we cleared the airfield, there was a terrible explosion in the back of the plane. We'd taken multiple hits, with at least one slug cutting a fuel line, sending JP-4 aviation gas spewing around the cabin. The crew chief shut off the valves that controlled that line and opened another to direct the fuel around it. We were rerouted to NHA Trang, the nearest airfield that could be foamed, and soon landed safely. To me, there was a significant message in the incident. For 14 days, at a cost of probably $30 million, 5,000 men beat the bush looking for Charlie and didn't find him. Yet on the very last day, at the end of our own airstrip, one VC with an automatic weapon brazenly peppered our very last aircraft full of slugs on its way out. "Goodbye, Yanks," each slug seemed to say. "See you again real soon." It was as if whatever we thought we were doing was really playing the game by their rules. I was at the brigade forward CP, merrily shuffling papers, when the 327th and 502nd began operations at Non Co, on the 2nd and 3rd Corps boundaries, like Phan Thiet, but well inland along the Cambodian border. Again, the battalions were faced with terrain they'd never experienced before. From the air, the triple canopy jungle obscured the maze of solid bamboo below, so thick in places that, with every man hacking through it, progress was still no greater than 30 meters an hour. 2 divisions could simply disappear in a few kilometers of that kind of bush. For the troops, plagued by long blackwood leeches whose bites led to infection on top of infection, little to no sunlight for days on end, and the beginning of the monsoons in this region of Vietnam, the first week of the operation was a strenuous, exhausting fight with the jungle and nothing else. Hank Emerson got even more ornery than his men, as day after day brought no contact for the O2. On a hunch, he decided to slip his unit south across the boundary into 3rd Corps and take advantage of an airstrip at Bujia Map, an abandoned Special Forces camp. When Emerson's L-19 was fired upon in an early morning reconnaissance of the airstrip, he knew his hunch was going to pay off. A short time later, Hank Lund's Alpha Company made contact and captured a malaria-ridden, panic-stricken soldier from the 141st NVA Regiment. Lund gave the prisoner water and covered him with a blanket. Then Emerson landed and, before hitting the guy with a long barrage of questions, gave him some cigarettes and a much-needed meal. The prisoner's reaction to this kindness was to break down. Hank's interpreter explained that the NVA had been told they'd be beaten, tortured, and then shot if captured by the Americans. As this was obviously not the case, the grateful prisoner eagerly provided Emerson with the straight skinny on the disposition of his unit. A 4-company ambush was waiting some 40 minutes away, with 6 more companies behind them at a further 40-minute walk. From the moment Hank Emerson treated that prisoner right, he could do no wrong. Lund had already discovered a well-used track. Little by little, Emerson's scattered units tightened up as Lund moved forward to converge on the enemy position. Emerson manoeuvred his people brilliantly. His bold, small unit checkerboard tactics, which he developed at the War College in 1964 specifically for Vietnam, while everyone else was still wallowing in the British experience in Malaya, gave way to an almost conventional configuration. In another turn of the evolutionary wheel on how to fight these guys, conventional was about the only way to go for what Hank wanted to do. The final confrontation with the 4-company ambush did not take place until the following day. Emerson told Lund, his senior ground commander, who'd proved to be as fine a combat leader as he was a staff and peacetime man, a rare combination, to plan the ground operation, and it worked like a charm. Lund's men, along with Captain George Hamilton's A Troop, 17th Cav, and Captain Ronnie Brown's composite task force of cavalry, recondo, and Apache Monad troops, silently encircled the waiting NVA ambush. Using massive air and artillery support, they proceeded to bushwhack the enemy in good old Yankee fashion. When it was over, of the 450 NVA troops who'd been lying in wait, only 50 remained alive and more or less intact. As for the 6-company ambush, the first prisoner had mentioned, Emerson chased these guys to the Cambodian border. There he could only watch helplessly as what was left of the 141st NVA slipped safely across into the neutral ground, where trucks could be seen waiting to ferry the enemy to the safety of their Cambodian sanctuaries. The successful operation at Bujia Map was a newsworthy item, jumped on by the press and higher HQ. Directly after his crowning success, Lund and his people received the dubious honour of clearing an LZ in the shattered jungle for Dan Rather and his television crew, a gruelling 8-hour job. But it was that kind of war. Swede Larsson came up to the border to see the battlefield and talk to Hank Emerson about the fight. It was one of the last things he'd do before going back to America to brief the Pentagon press on what was happening in Vietnam. During that briefing, besides declaring that the 101st was the best fighting unit in Vietnam, Larsson would relate the fact, well known at the highest levels in Vietnam and proven beyond doubt at Bujia Map, that the North Vietnamese were operating out of Cambodia. This information would be big news in the USA, which by day's end would be vehemently denied by the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. The press would then go back to General Larsson, whose innocent honesty had been hurriedly locked together in the interim, and he would say he stood corrected from the corner he'd been backed into for reasons he didn't know. This incident well characterized one of the biggest problems in the war, which only got worse as the conflict went on. Out there, everyday American men were playing for the ultimate stakes, yet back home it seemed as if the politicians and bureaucrats who sent them there were playing by a different set of rules, if not a completely different game. There were NVA in Cambodia, 4 to 6 regiments worth, who were already killing American soldiers in South Vietnam. If they remained unstopped, they would kill many more. To guys like me on the ground, it was as simple as that. So none of us could figure out why things were not that simple. When Walt Minden was evacuated the night before the 1st Brigade's next big mission, I had already been in Vietnam for 13 months. On top of that, I was scheduled to rotate home in just 4 weeks. So I was incredibly surprised to find, on the morning of the operation, that I was to take Minden's place as commander. "You were down there 7 months and know it better than anyone," General Pearson explained when he called me to his command tent at the Central Highland Special Forces camp at Du To. "We're going to have some tough opposition this time, so get right into the plan. Any questions, come back to me." It took everything in my power to keep from dancing out of the tent. "Darrell, we got a battalion!" I sang to my patient driver waiting by our jeep. It was not just my fondest wish come true, but at that time in my career, the highest accolade I could receive. "I'll get our gear together immediately, sir," Darrell replied with a huge grin, knowing full well that after I'd taken him with me from brigade to battalion and back to brigade, I would surely want him by my side now when I confronted the challenge I'd been waiting and preparing for since I was a rifleman in Italy so many years before. I arrived at the battalion and it was Old Home Week. All the old-timers rushed up with a chorus of "Great to have you back." It was as if I'd been away at brigade a year rather than a month. I had a look at the battle plan. The mission was to relieve a nearby Special Forces camp at T Marang, atop a high mountain, reportedly surrounded by a large NVA force and under the constant harassment of mortar fire. A year before, the June monsoons had set the stage for the enemy to successfully overrun 8 such outposts, including our present base at Do To, near the Laos-Cambodia-South Vietnam border. With the monsoon season of '66 about to start any day, the powers that be felt it better to relieve an abandoned T Marang rather than risk a replay of the events of the previous year, which had caused incredible panic that South Vietnam would be cut in half by marauding communists. No two commanders ease a tactical problem the same way. As I examined Minden's attack plan, I knew I'd alter it. After the airmobile assault phase, which in just 2 hours would put us in at LZs behind the 2 more objectives, my reasoning was simply that I didn't think the NVA gave 2 hoots in hell about destroying the Special Forces camp at T Marang. What they wanted was to destroy the relieving force. I was sure we were being enticed into a very conventional, by guerrilla standards, Viet Cong insurgent trap, luring the counterinsurgent force into a situation by making it believe that one of its camps was threatened and that a quick victory could be achieved by saving the day. The fact that 2 NVA ralliers had just given themselves up at Doto and reported that the SF camp would soon be hit only added to my conviction that Team Orang was a trap. Minden's plan called for 2 rifle companies to attack parallel with the 2 roads leading to the camp, one from the north and one from the east, with the 3rd company remaining at the LZ with our command post and mortar platoon. I felt sure this was exactly what the enemy expected, and they would be waiting along the 2 roads in ambush. So I decided that after the airmobile phase, we'd go cross-country instead. Despite the hellish navigation and difficult terrain, we would take our time. Team Orang had been under siege since the middle of May. It was now June 3rd, and another day or so wouldn't hurt them. I had only one instruction to give to the battalion before we jumped off. Since the Joe Rogers days ended with the light Wolfhound-style packs, he and I had insisted the above-the-rest troops carry just the basics: 1 set of fatigues and dry socks, a poncho, jungle blanket and sea rations, all tied up with sea wire and thrown over the shoulder, easily flipped off when a firefight developed. But these essentials had gradually been added to until the men were going into battle like mules. As Johnny Howard used to say, give a trooper a rucksack and he'll fill it. The big loads were disastrous in these highlands of steep mountains, tall trees and thick undergrowth, catching on everything and sapping vital strength long before contact was even made. So the single order was a simple one: lighten up. The only question I had about the operation was how I was supposed to go into battle with a call sign like Bald Eagle, especially with Emerson going in as the glamorous gunfighter. I told Pearson I wanted to be Bal Eagle, not Bald, and he quickly had his comm officer change it. With a matter of fact, "Yes, that fits you better," Pearson agreed. The Tigers had secured our LZ on day 1, the day before I joined the battalion, and now our airmobile assault was made opposed. We made our way overland with a scout section moving Aussie-style well in front of the main force of each company, with our big fists locked together. The enemy realised he wasn't going to get his pound of flesh for free, and in the 2 days it took to get to our objective, we had less than a handful of contacts. We reached the Team Orang camp and prepared for the movement of its 150 inhabitants down the hill to Dak To. The North Vietnamese had broken off their mortar attacks on the outpost, no doubt disappointed we hadn't stumbled into their trap. Still, their plans had not been completely foiled. According to Don Corman, who had heard about it over the artillery net while we were travelling cross-country, the ARVN regiment had made their approach to Team Orang along one of the roads, been ambushed just as we would have been, and taken 4 dead and 19 wounded. Hank Emerson and General Pearson and his staff flew into Team Orang for a what to do next conference. Should we continue to look around here or give up and move elsewhere? Between the ARVN ambush and my gut feeling, I knew that regardless of his present silence, our foe was still in the area. But before I joined the powwow, I wandered over to one of the inhabitants of Team Orang, a Monard corporal, who confirmed it. I pulled out a map and asked him, "Where are the NVA?" He replied, indicating a valley below the outpost. "Down there." I asked, "Are there many NVA there?" He answered, "Many, maybe a regiment, maybe more." I asked, "Do you know that for a fact?" The Monard said, "I patrol there, but I never go there now. None of my men will go there." "Thanks a lot," I told him, and joined General Pearson and his staff. The latter were firmly of the opinion that the 24th NVA Regiment, our reported opponent, had vacated the battlefield, and therefore so should we. Of course, Pearson's staff didn't know what the Monard corporal had told me. As I listened to their argument, it quickly became clear that through some serious breakdown in communication, they also didn't know about the previous day's ambush of the ARVN unit on the road to Team Orang. As such, their arguments for leaving were totally logical, even if they were totally wrong. Meanwhile, I was smelling an incredible opportunity. In the unit competition stakes, this would put me well in front of Emerson's unit. So when Pearson asked for my opinion, without going into details, I said I thought I might stick around Myan for a while and have a look in the valley. "It's all yours," the general said. I deployed my units in a reconnaissance screen, with little fingers moving carefully down the valley, each platoon no more than an hour's reinforcement time from another. Ben Willis's units made 3 sharp contacts with an estimated reinforced platoon of NVA. Tragically, during the fight, a friendly artillery barrage landed right in the center of one of Ben's platoons, killing 5 troopers and wounding 5 more. Everything stopped while we sorted out the debacle and evacuated the casualties. It wasn't exactly the greatest way to start the operation. As darkness fell, I had everyone hold up and dig in, planning to continue the hunt come first light. All was quiet until 0200 hours, when Captain Don Juan's B Battery Artillery, which was in direct support of us and under operational control, came under attack from an estimated battalion-sized enemy force. Heavy mortar fire preceded the assault, and then, with bugles blowing, the NVA came at the position in waves, as the Chinese had in Korea, and as the Viet Minh had against France's elite Mobile Group 100 on this very same Central Highlands ground a dozen years before. The gunners quickly found they were virtually on their own. Only one platoon of a company, which was OPCON under the command of EXO Carl Beach, and had been tasked with securing Juan's battery, actually got into position to help them. The rest of the company had been too spread out. As such, some of the company's numbers got pinned with the outpost squad closest to the enemy's ingress route, nearly being trampled by racing hordes of enemy soldiers intent only on Juan's position. Meanwhile, with a Smokey the Bear flare ship hovering over the battlefield, dropping flares and lighting the ground like day, Juan's artillerymen fought like lions for their lives and their positions, even reclaiming overrun guns and firing them point-blank into their attackers' ranks,